Hello, everybody. Welcome back to ESAS. Today we're going to be continuing on with the Bloodborne analysis by Acer Aesthetics. We've made it over an hour in. We are... Fuck. This is going to take forever to actually get through this video at this rate, unless we just have a long period of just watching shit. But, yeah, here we are. And we're just going to jump right in. But a few quick things before we start. I have been working on the Skyrim commentaries part 2, going over the Civil War. Everything's recorded at this point. I just need to edit it. So I'm going to try to space these out sort of 2 weeks apart from each other, just to kind of give a little bit of breathing room in between. So because so far scripting and editing are basically a breeze. It's just a matter of finding time to do it. So the part 2 will probably come out in probably early May, I would think. Not sure yet, but we'll see. But yeah, so let's just let's have some fun with Bloodborne now, and let's get back into it. I believe we just wrapped up this section, so let's get into Cathedral Ward and hear what this gentleman has to say.
So, after some time of beast hunting, it became obvious that the tactics of the church needed updating since the beasts had gotten bigger and since Garmin had disappeared. This was where Ludwig came in. The weapons associated with him are things like the Kirkhammer and my new sword, Ludwig's Holy Blade, and notably, these weapons all are standardly used by the church and are much bigger than what the hunters under Garmin used. Saw cleavers and rakios might be fine against your standard beasts, but once they get large, you really want something big to attack them with. I'll be making a conscious effort in the rest of the playthrough to continue experimenting with items, and I think that's noteworthy because Ludwig's Holy Blade, unfortunately, can easily turn the game into one where you just browbeat everything in your way, as its two-handed variant is an optimal tool for most of the game. Funnily enough, though, once it becomes my main weapon, I'll actually be making a downgrade because, unless you really want to argue tiny details, the Saw Spear is arguably the best weapon in the game. It has excellent gem slots, its damage is respectable, its moveset is incredibly versatile, and it does not lock players from using their left-handed weapon once it's been transformed. It places no limitations on weapon buffing like a certain arcane moon sword the community seems to love, and it's also perfect for one-on-ones and groups. The reason I'll be making the shift has to do with wanting to illustrate some points with the build. Longtime followers of the channel will remember that from time to time I've elaborated on a very, very niche thing I like in games, and that is when they provide an experience outside of or in opposition to their wheelhouse. That is to say, Silent Hill plays very claustrophobic, so I really like it when those games go into open spaces, as the claustrophobia is maintained with the tank controls and fog. Another example I frequently point to of this phenomena is when Souls games do platforming, which is probably best exemplified in this game by the area connecting this place to the abandoned old workshop. And another example of Bloodborne going against the grain with its challenges is seen in this little alleyway area. And that is that Bloodborne plays best in the open spaces, and this area is pretty cramped. The movesets in these games are incredibly archaic.
Okay, I gotta back that up a little bit just to get some of that point again. He took a really long time to say that he likes experiencing parts of games that are sort of antithetical to how they're built. So I just want to back that up and get that full quote in there. Because that is kind of a weird thing to mention, that you like games doing stuff like that.
Side of or in opposition to their wheelhouse. That is to say, Silent Hill plays very claustrophobic, so I really like it when those games go into open spaces, as the claustrophobia is maintained with the tank controls and fog. Another...
Okay, so I've not played Silent Hill, so I don't know exactly what he's talking about, but I've seen a couple clips, and it's like, is he saying that he likes games that maintain a feel because of the mechanics, but the atmosphere changes? Is that the point he's making there, or is it because of playing the game, or have the game doing something that it's not built to do? Because I'm either way, I think it's a weird point to make, especially when you bring up platforming in this series, because pretty much all of these things, platforming sucks. Just period. Just it all sucks. Like until like you get to like Sekiro, where it actually has like platforming, like with useful mechanics to help you with it, and then Elden Ring just has like a jump. But that's weird.
Another example I frequently point to of this phenomena is when Souls games do platforming, which is probably best exemplified in this game by the area connecting this place to the abandoned old workshop. And another example of Bloodborne going against the grain with its challenges is seen in this little alleyway area. And that is that Bloodborne plays best in the open spaces, and this area is pretty cramped. The move sets in these games are incredibly archaic. If you run into a wall, the hunter will run into a wall and not stop, even though it goes against every law of physics. The game makes little effort to limit your freedom of movement for the sake of realism or immersion, and in that sense, Bloodborne is very primitive. But here's something: the less a game concerns itself with realism, the less players mind when expectations of realism are broken because they never really developed those anyway. And
Okay, there's 2 points there that I gotta break down for a minute. So let's go back and get that first one. Just kind of talking about the archaicness.
it's best in the open spaces, and this area is pretty cramped. The move sets in these games are incredibly archaic. If you run into a wall, the hunter will run into a wall and not stop, even though it goes against every law of physics. The game makes little effort to limit your freedom of movement for the sake of realism or.
Okay, so this is one thing that I'd like to talk about regarding that. I think part of the reason why those things are left sort of on the wayside is partially because what's the point of working on a system to stop the player when they hit a wall, right? Like, what's the point? Right? It's like you have to devise a mechanical system for a player to stop when they hit an object. It's like the player already stops physically moving, so there's no real point to have an animation where you stop like walking in a direction, right? It's basically wasted time and effort to do something that looks realistic but doesn't actually impact gameplay at all, right? And that's the kind of point that I'm making here, is that this is not like a movie where there's like a special effects mistake. For example, like if you have a character that is supposed to walk into a wall and then turn around, but they literally walk through the wall because of some CGI mistake or something, you know, that's kind of a thing where it's like you have made a mistake with that. But in a video game, it's a system that doesn't really need to be there for the game to function, right? Unless the game has a specific thing where interacting with a wall has significance to it, right? Like, for example, games that have some sort of traversal function, like Dying Light, need specific mechanics that work with going up against a wall and having certain things happen when you collide with a wall, right? Because, like in Dying Light, as the example, you know, you need to be able to climb the wall. So when your character physically touches the wall in the game, there are mechanics in place that make you climb the wall, right? But in Bloodborne, they don't have that. So having a mechanic where you would stop walking towards a wall is just kind of wasted effort on something that could be put towards something more meaningful. And that's the kind of thing that I think confuses me a little bit about what he's saying here, is like he's bringing up this mechanic as sort of a weird take on that mechanic existing, it seems like. And maybe this leads into that second thing he's saying, but let's get into the second part, because I think he's setting up something with these 2 points.
Immersion. And in that sense, Bloodborne is very primitive. But here's something. The less a game concerns itself with realism, the less players mind when expectations of realism are broken because they never really developed those anyway.
Okay, I think that's very dependent on the person, right? And I think that's one of those things that I think is very hard to sort of predict from like a game developer standpoint. Like we expect certain things to be realistic, right? When we play a game that's a part of a franchise, right? Like we expect that, in these games, if you drop a long way, you will take damage. That's kind of an expected mechanic for movement and traversal and fall damage, right? When you die from really small heights, that's when it becomes an issue because it's like that is ridiculous in every sense of the word because we've not seen that sort of punishing system before. It's like it doesn't matter whether it's and this is the thing, it doesn't really matter in games if things are realistic. It matters if they're consistent with the tone of the game, right? And that's really what matters because I mentioned this before, but above all else, a game needs to be consistent in terms of its playing, like how it plays and how players play it, right? So everything else kind of takes a backseat to the actual mechanics of playing the game. And what he said here is just kind of a thing where I wonder what he would say about a lot of games, just because, like there's no real reason to talk about your character stopping when they hit a wall in this game because there's no mechanical function that is changed when you collide with a wall, right? Like there's no like there's nothing to really talk about there, and having a realistic expectation with that kind of thing doesn't really help support the point he's making as much as it just brings up a random factoid for people to think about. What I would use personally is the fact that bosses, it's very unrealistic that these massive bosses will crush down on us and not break all the bones in our body, right. That's a very like obvious sort of like when it's like when you get shot in a video game, right, and you heal up over time, right, or whether your health regens or whatever. It's like it's unrealistic that you'd be able to regenerate as fast as you do. But if we regenerated realistically, then the game would be incredibly tense, probably incredibly boring, and you'd probably have to actually bandage yourself over and over and over. And this is one thing that a friend and I actually went through when playing a game. I believe it was called Green Hell, I think was the name of it. It's like some jungle survival game. We played it, I think, for about an hour. And during that time, I hated all of the micromanagement that you had to do in order to do a lot of mechanical things, right? And it's a thing where, okay, it may be realistic where, if you get like hurt in the arm, you have to, select your arm, raise your arm, turn your arm to find the wound, and then deal with the wound. It's like, while that can be engaging on an immersive level, it's really time consuming comparative to what a lot of other games would typically do when it comes to healing. Right. And that's something that I think can become an issue in games when they take something a little too far into the realistic territory. Now, but like I said, things should be consistent rather than realistic. Right. And that's really the main point that I think should be kind of taken from what I'm saying here is just games don't have to be realistic because there is a point where the realism bogs down the gameplay, right? And I do think that it's much more important for a game to be consistent with its own mechanics and the way things work than to be realistic in that same sense.
And these Souls games have always managed to elegantly walk the tightrope of silliness and grit. I like the platforming in these games, not in spite of their primitive movement schemes, but because of them. And I like the relatively tight level design in this area for the same reason. No part of the movement was developed to make for good maneuvering in tight alleyways, and so when the game presents you with that level layout, the challenge can become more interesting because we're being asked to rethink movement, asked to consider how to overcome the lack of dedicated mechanics to solve the challenge at hand. Sadly, Bloodborne does not feature as many of these moments as Dark Souls 1 did, but it still manages to have some of them crop up from time to time and make the 3 people in the world, me included, who enjoy when a game willingly grinds against its own core gameplay giddy.
Yeah, I think this is one thing where I think he does acknowledge, he's like one of the 3 people that likes when these games do shit that they're not built for, which is, I think, a thing that's like, you're free to have your own opinions, either way. I think it is an interesting point that he decided to bring this up in the video when there's no real reason to bring up this point in this video with this game, right? Like, if you wanted to talk about it in terms of a progression, perhaps leading up to Sekiro or something, where the movement actually is a lot more dynamic in terms of platforming and stuff like that, I do think that this would be better served in that video rather than this one. Because, I mean, I think it's a very safe thing to say that, From Software has had a hard time with traversal, specifically with platforming, just because they didn't really have dedicated functions for movement besides the basics and then a jump, right? Like, that's basically it. Like, that's all you had. And the jump was clunky in the previous games, before pre-Sekiro, right? Where, you have to hold down the run button and then while still running you have to jump, right? There's no dedicated jump button that's just for jump, right? So one reason why I think Elden Ring was able to do a lot more with its platforming, because you actually had dedicated buttons for jump, right? So you could actually have things where jumping could, you know, add a new dimension to combat where it's a lot easier to manage, but also allows you to do more parkour things where you can do things on a much more vertical level than previously. Like, how many areas in Elden Ring do you have to hop up, through, just hitting the jump button over and over to get up certain obstacles or to get around certain things or to go through like shortcuts and things through like windows and shit, right? Like, if that was in the traditional Souls game style, it'd be much more annoying to do, and that would be a example of the game going against its own mechanics, right? Which is kind of the thing that's the extreme version of what he kind of just talked about. Now the difference between what he's saying and what he kind of showed, though, is that the mechanics of movement in this game, while simple, there's nothing that actually goes against what you're doing in the given game with that stuff, right? You have areas where you do have to do some sort of traversal, typically by dropping down to places, right? But that's not really something that goes against the mechanics established, right? And neither does fighting through the alleyway negate or go against the mechanics of combat or exploration, right? Like, these things are not some deep mechanical. Uh, like the reason I'm bringing all this up is because he's making a point that seems rather moot when you're talking about this game specifically, right? And it's the thing that kind of gets to me about it is he's talking about games going against what they're basically designed to do, and it's a thing where they're not really doing that. Like, he's reading. It feels like he's reading a little too deep into this when it's as simple as tight areas are going to be more restrictive than open areas, and the only parkour you really do in these games or any kind of traversal is usually jumping down onto something, right? Like all this stuff is that simple. Like, there's nothing deeper to it than what you have happening, where you drop down from ledge to ledge to reach somewhere, or you fight enemies in various environments, some of which are going to be very narrow. It's like these aren't massive changes to how the game functions, and these aren't things that have, like, these are not the game going against its own mechanics. Like, these are little instances of the game changing things up to change the pace of what's going on or to slot into the world where it needs to exist physically, right? And they just add a gimmick challenge, in with the dropping section, right? That dropping section to the old workshop, for example, it's just a gimmick. Like, it's just a simple gimmick that a staircase was made for lore reasons. It was destroyed, and if you want to make it down there, you just have to jump from platform to platform and survive. That's basically it. Like, there's no deeper mechanical thing to that, right? There's no deeper reason for that being the way it is. You know, it's not the game trying to take mechanics it gave you and flip it on its head. It's not trying to do that. You know, it's just having you walk or jump or drop in specific places to get from point A to point B. It's not that deep. And I feel like he's putting a lot more emphasis on it being deeper than it really is. And I feel like that's just because he likes that sequence and he likes having to do those type of things. You know, and this is the kind of thing that I've seen a lot where some people will sort of project depth onto something when it's not actually that deep to begin with. But anyway, let's get back to it.
We have now opened up the path back to the Cathedral Ward Lantern, which means I'm going to be completing the optional stuff in Cathedral Ward before fighting Vicar Amelia. The most important thing is picking up our NPCs and unlocking the entire area to get Eileen's questline to advance. This will take a bit of time to complete, so I think I should have the H.P. Lovecraft talk here rather than delay it any further. Since I'm going deep into Lovecraft spoilers here, and since much has already been said about his stories and how they tie to Bloodborne, I won't hold it against you if you want to skip this section. Jump to this to hear our talk about the Henrik part of Eileen's quest. Now that those traitors are gone, let's get into it. First off, my credentials as your guide to Eldritch Horrors. I've read every story Lovecraft ever wrote at least twice, and I've also hunted down and read every one of the collaborations he did that I could find. And as it relates to Bloodborne, the 5 most obviously important are the Shadow over Innsmouth at the Mountains of Madness, the Call of Cthulhu, but not necessarily for the reasons you think, the Color Out of Space, and the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath. And actually, with Kadath, you could probably lop in the rest of the Randolph Carter stories. I'm a bit sad that I could not work out any connections to my favorite story of his, The Whisperer in Darkness, but as a consolation prize, maybe the original intent with the Chalice Dungeons was that they acted a bit like the great race of Yith from The Shadow Out of Time, another one of Lovecraft's best, what with the seemingly non-paradox-inducing time travel.
Okay, so I just realized this section is probably going to go on for another like 6 minutes. And I've not read any of Lovecraft's stories at all, so I have really no context for what the stories are about. I just have a vague notion of the type of stories that he would do with a lot of cosmic horror type of things. So if he talks about the relationship between Bloodborne and those stories during this section, then good, but otherwise we're probably just going to sit here and listen to him talk about those things for about 5 minutes. So if I'm quiet for a while, that's probably why.
Interestingly, although Bloodborne borrows a lot of ideas from Lovecraft, there's not a single outright mention of any of his works. Cthulhu and the gang are all public domain, but FromSoft opted to create their own mythos, and I think the game is richer for it. It means fewer preconceived notions of where the story is allowed to go. I don't think people would be very happy if we could kill Nyarlathotep or Yog-Sothoth with a boomhammer.
I think this is also a point where, like, just because they're public domain doesn't mean that making a story in them is going to be interesting. You know, like From Software takes a lot of influence from a lot of different things. That's very evident in the way they name things and the way they construct things and the way they, visualize the games in terms of like the art direction and the style, right? It's not one of those things where, I think it's just that I think a lot of this can be simply summarized as the developers really liked the aesthetic of H.P. Lovecraft's sort of creations and decided to apply that when making this video game. I think it's as simple as that, right? And I don't think you need to delve too deep into each individual reference and how that works in the context of Bloodborne, because Bloodborne is its own thing, right? It's its own sort of universe. So it doesn't really, it might add extra context to how how it started in one creation and then led to another. But from a game perspective, I can understand it like aesthetically doing specific things for the game. But after that, it's kind of a thing where you're just kind of mentioning, Lovecraftian stuff because you like Lovecraftian stuff, and it doesn't really tie into the game anymore. But let's keep going.
It also means that the fundamentals underpinning cosmic horror needn't really apply to Bloodborne. To the few humans still uninitiated, Lovecraft's work deals with the insignificance of humanity in the face of grander beings whose existence makes us look like mere amoeba. Our survival in the face of their existence is not owed to our adaptability, resourcefulness, or will, or anything like that, but because they just haven't wiped us out yet, even though they easily could. We still exist because they don't care. They are so far beyond us that they might not even care to separate us from the houseflies we look down at. In the face of all of this, all of humanity is small and insignificant, and all those who come into contact with the Eldritch truth go mad. Lovecraft's protagonists are usually unreliable narrators, as they are detailing events which cause them great psychological trauma. And their retellings aren't meant to rouse people into proactive collective action, but rather serve as warnings that it would be better for humanity to continue its ignorant, insignificant existence than to go to the places where dead gods may still dream. Bloodborne twists this central pillar of cosmic horror because here, interacting with the Great Ones is what the characters want. They make deals with the game's Great Ones and hope to one day have the shackles of humanity removed, hope to elevate their beings so that they themselves may become Great Ones. The humans in Bloodborne seek the Eldritch truth rather than turn their gaze away from it like in Lovecraft's writings. That's the core difference between the two. But the writings of Lovecraft are still the base on which much of Bloodborne was built. We see that the Chalice dungeons draw on Lovecraft, what with them housing sleeping gods looked after by a slave race they created, kind of like how in the Call of Cthulhu.
Come
There's
on.
nothing like the thrill of finding the best deal. That's why we've got
Cthulhu Lies Dead.
I wish I could get paid for ads that appear on other people's videos when I stream it. That'd be nice.
Dreaming, and how in the Mountains of Madness, the ancient ruins of a long-gone civilization houses the still living slave race created by greater beings. Though the Thumerians never went genocidal on the Great Ones. Well, actually, they kinda did, in the sense that humans are Thumerians and went on a hunt for them. Though, admittedly, we don't know if all humans in this universe are the descendants of Thumerians. More on this later. We see that the statues around Yharnam never quite capture the likenesses of the amygdalas or Great Ones, kinda like how in the Call of Cthulhu, once Cthulhu awoke, the artists of the world began creating works unconsciously inspired by him. We see in some promotional material talks of a Yharnam look, an obvious reference to the Innsmouth look from the Shadow over Innsmouth, which described the fish-like appearance of the residents of Innsmouth, which was caused by them being hybrid offsprings of humans and the sea-dwelling deep ones. The Arnhem look isn't described as large, unblinking eyes, flat noses, white mouths, hair loss, and graying skin, but rather as Yarnamites being asymmetrical, as you can see in their limbs and faces, and them being hairy. And it's not because they are the descendants of fish, but because their exposure to old blood is reawakening their Temerian heritage and inducing beasthood. Thumerians are also seen to be very asymmetrical, and the beasts are all very hairy. Also, just like the residents of Innsmouth, Yarnamites are very suspicious of outsiders, and just like the protagonist in that book, we can hear, if we bother checking the doors, a lot of guttural screams all throughout the town. But if there is one story which Bloodborne leans on more than any other, it is the dream quest of unknown Kadath. So, Lovecraft's writing has been categorized into three phases. First was his early horror writing, then the Cthulhu mythos, and finally his dream cycle. His earliest stories were macabre, but not as out there as the later ones got. The Cthulhu mythos saw the establishment of cosmicism, and then the dream cycle saw Lovecraft sort of conquer the cosmicism. Man is nothing to the elder gods, sure, but in the dreamlands they can meet and negotiate with one another. And the cool thing, which I've never seen anyone talk about, is that this game's plot unfurls exactly like the literary career of H.P. Lovecraft. The beginning is all about the gothic horror, then we get to Bergenworth and things get cosmic and unknowable, but once we enter the Nightmare of Mensis, we literally will be able to trade blows with great ones. And that's Lovecraft talk, for now. Because we're gonna go fight Henrik and then enter the next stage of the game. I said I wasn't going to do every NPC quest in the game, and I meant that, but I still decided to get every NPC I could to Erden Chapel so that when the time comes I can illustrate some things.
All right, so kind of going back to what he said about the whole kind of Lovecraftian arc of his career and the game as a whole. I think that's one of those things that you can definitely read into it one way or the other. It could be simple. Like I'm of the mind where if it's simple, doesn't need to be deeper. You know, like my thing with Bloodborne is just that you slowly get deeper and deeper into the nightmare until you're literally shaping the nightmare. That's the way I view it. You know, in terms of just your progression throughout the game and how crazy things get as you go. You know, but people can read into it and make comparisons to things, you know, all over the place. You know, so I mean, I think this is one of those things where it's kind of interpretable depending on how you want to view it yourself.
Eileen's quest will require me to go back to where we fought Gascoigne and kill his now blood-drunk old partner. Henrik is a much tougher fight than Gascoigne was, but not because of his own innate strength or anything like that, but rather because Eileen joins the fight shortly after it begins, and half of the battle is trying to chip away at Henrik while leaving Eileen unharmed. If she dies here, then her quest line is over, and since I really wanted her oath rune, I needed to allow myself to die a few more times than I might have wanted. Totally intentional. This was the most clutch moment of gameplay in the entire recording because this was the moment I needed to get, or else I had to restart everything. Thankfully, I did enough pre-recordings and test runs that I'm able to get Henrik down. I don't do it exclusively for the material rewards from Eileen, though. Once Henrik is dead, I can purchase his outfit from the inside messengers in the Hunter's Dream, and since I'll be going up against Darkbeast Parl soon, that outfit is a smart investment, considering it has very good bolt protection. Wearing it will trigger some Yharnam villagers to yell death to the minister. The lore explanation for this is that Henrik was the hunting partner of Gascoigne, who is the minister in question. I already said that I'd really like it if more of the game responded to the get-ups and items you used, even if it was just changing up the small stuff like that. So it should fall on me to acknowledge when the game does this. Because the Vicar Amelia fight is up, there are things I need to talk about, because near the end, we'll be diving into a significant piece of cut content which I need to set up in this area. First of all, there's an often missed message near the entrance to the boss arena which tells players to inscribe Lawrence's adage upon their flesh. This is flowery language for touching his skull at the altar, which will reveal the Bergenworth adage, which doubles as the password to the Forbidden Woods leading to Bergenworth. Lawrence's skull at the altar is clearly that of a beast, and with Amelia's incoming transformation, the fate of the Healing Church is just about sealed, as it will be without any vicar. Though they managed to linger after losing Lawrence, so maybe I'm underselling their capabilities. Regardless, the Menzies ritual will probably get them. Amelia is the final main game beast boss, so after defeating her is when I'll be making the main weapon swap. The same tactics that worked for the cleric beast Gascoigne and the blood-starved beast work to make this boss into a breeze. That's Oil learns to increase the damage she takes from fire, fire papers, fire gem-equipped weapons, and Molotov cocktails to deal set fire damage. And if you want to risk it, beast blood pellets for some damage increases. And of course, serrated weapons. Another strategy I'm employing is to use the art of quickening, which I got from the old hunter's bone. This changes my rolling and dashing animation into smoky teleports, and also increases the speed at which I can do this. Activating the old hunter's bone costs 4 quicksilver bullets, and the effect lasts for 16 seconds. Since we can gain 5 bullets by using the blood bullet mechanic, provided players can recover the health they paid for it, the old hunter's bone can be almost free to use. It's kind of a shame that its effect is only active for 16 seconds though, because I can imagine this being a much more used item if it lasted longer. A Bloodborne design motif which is repeated with Vicar Amelia is wrappings covering eyes. We saw this design in Gascoigne and we'll see it more still. This connects to the idea of insight. Long ago, Master Willem, who also has eye coverings, concluded that beasthood represented not a failure of the scientific part of inducing human evolution, but of the spiritual one. That without proper wisdom, the old blood would ruin humanity. That humans were becoming beasts literally because their minds could not operate on grand enough thought to warrant grander designs. And so, the blindfolds came. The idea was to close off all external visual stimuli so that eyes may begin to grow on the inside. In other words, they would focus their mental energy within, and in doing so could elevate their thoughts, could gain insight. And judging by the characters we've seen thus far wearing these things, there seems to be a lot of truth to this. Gascoigne and Amelia both transformed into beasts in front of us, sure, but they were able to ward off the transformation for some time, and the game goes out of its way to show that Gascoigne actually manages to be pulled back briefly when the music box is played, which reminds him of his family. It's not enough to cure him, but it shows that there's hope to fight back the beasthood. Likewise, Amelia was clutching a pendant when we came in and she was reciting a prayer, and it's possible that her faith was able to hold back the transformation. In an interview, Miyazaki explained that one of the core themes of the game is the inner clash within beast enemies. In his words, the urge to transform into a beast is in conflict with the basic sense of humanity we all have. That humanity serves as a kind of shackle, keeping the transformation in its place. The stronger the shackle keeping that urge to transform in place is, the larger the recoil once that shackle is finally broken. The results cause you to transform into a larger creature or a more twisted one. The struggle between these two urges is one concept here. You see that pretty clearly with the beast characters designed early on, especially the cleric beast, which serves as their icon of sorts. That connects with the idea that the cleric is really the most fearsome beast of them all. The longer one pushes back the transformation, the bigger the blowback becomes. But here's the thing. Lawrence may not have been all wrong to embrace the old blood. Old blood makes bodies malleable, so if transcendence must have a physical aspect, then old blood might be the best tool which humans have, if the trajectory of transformation could be realigned from beasts, that is. And we see in many instances of the game that certain characters attempt just that. And Willem is then probably on the right path when he talks about eyes on the inside, when he talks about insight. When Vicar Amelia dies, the world state changes to night. Different levels are loaded, with some enemies getting buffs and some enemies being put into a sleeping idle animation, which they wake up from once confronted by the player. In the late game, the illusion of a cohesive world is somewhat undermined, what with areas like Bergenworth and Old Yarnum not getting a red moon, and this is because the changes to the world are not variables which can be flipped on in every level. It used to be like that, as I briefly talked about earlier, but late into development, this feature was scrapped, and we got the more caveman approach to changing of the world we have now. That is, instead of having one cathedral ward level, which can look inside of the game's code and see where in the story the player is and adjust itself accordingly. So, like, if the player has just killed Amelia, activate this skybox, this lighting script, these enemies get these functions activated, etc. Instead of doing that, the game just loads an altogether new level which looks like Cathedral Ward in nighttime. Early adopters of the game will remember it having some pretty infuriating load times, and it's possible that these more flexible levels were dumbed down for the caveman approach we have now because they simply had too many variables to check for them to load in proper time. The entire world map seems seamless, but it actually dumps the areas you aren't in out of the memory the moment it's able to. And if you could get an unpatched version of the game running, it is possible to run fast enough through the levels that the game is unable to fully render the graphics, leaving players standing on invisible collision boxes. The solution to this then would either be segmenting the entire world off with loading screens or reducing the amount of stuff the game needed to do to render each level. That second option was taken, and I think we're all the poorer for it because it seems to not only have robbed us of some really interesting stories, but we also lost the greater potential of the insight mechanic. Miyazaki's exposure to Lovecraft seems to not have predominantly been the stories, but rather the tabletop RPGs. And Bloodborne's deviations from Lovecraft, which we talked about earlier, might just have to do with this. The Call of Cthulhu is the most well known of Lovecraft's stories, which is strange because it's not really as strong as his best stuff. But what it has is a good utility of many of his conventions. And so when nerds in the 1980s wanted to make role playing games out of his stories, this one made the most sense. Cults, elder gods, creeping madness, an unraveling mystery, it's all here. And if one didn't know better, one might think the story was based on a playthrough of an RPG module rather than the other way around. Call of Cthulhu is especially important for our medium because it was that book which game designers looked to when they were systemizing Lovecraft. And many of the systems they built for the original Call of Cthulhu RPG are actually in Bloodborne. Kinda. Your traditional tabletop RPG will have the player's stats represented with numbers and will use dice to guarantee randomness in the player's interaction with the system. As the player's stats go up, or as they apply appropriate stats for tasks, the chance of failure decreases. Usually, there are some mechanics to reward role playing, like special bonus cards given to players who do things which are very in character for their PC to do. And contrary to video games, the fun of tabletop usually doesn't come from the combat or from engaging with the system the game runs on, but rather from the role playing that is facilitated by them. It's harder for video games to accomplish this since technology is still a bit too primitive to function as a dungeon master which can adapt to the players fiddling around with the game world.
Yeah, that's one thing that's very true. Is like if like part of the reason why a lot of games that have that sort of like D&D sort of tabletop function where you can kind of play as your character and the developers really work hard to make sure that you have every option available to you. Kind of similar to like Baldur's Gate 3. There's usually a lot of options in games like that, that make it feel like it's a tabletop game where you can actually throw out crazy ideas to your DM and see if they'll run with it and just see where things go as you develop that thing right. And I think that is one of the things that I think would be a really, really cool game is if they managed to somehow create an artificial intelligence that would actually be able to run with the idea of changing the game on the fly based on the player's input. We're probably closer to that than we think, but I'm pretty sure we're not there yet. But it is that kind of thing where the fun of role playing in like a D&D campaign, for example, is the main fun of it, right? The combat can be engaging in different ways, especially when you get creative with it. But the role playing aspect is the ultimate charm of games like that. And it's very, very obvious that a lot of these FromSoft games took influence from D&D and other sort of like classic like board game type of fantasy worlds and the way those things work.
Call of Cthulhu was a bit different from your stock standard RPG, even though it had stuff like stats and dice. What made Call of Cthulhu different was that it was based on percentile dice. So a player's stat would range from 1 to 100, and once they performed an action, the stat associated with the action, so like making a sandwich would probably be a cooking stat, for example, that stat would be checked against the die. If your cooking stat was 50, then you'd need to get 50 or lower on the die to succeed. Stats can increase with play, and as they get higher, the odds that the player rolls a dice and gets a lower number gets higher as well. Voila, that's how they simulated probability. But running alongside those stats was a sanity counter, which would decrease as the player encountered the game's horrors. Because of that, the games often ended with players going mad and being horribly butchered or going into asylums or something. And that was the big difference between Call of Cthulhu and other RPGs. Call of Cthulhu did not expect the player character to make it through in one piece. And that's impressive if you ask me. A very good adaptation of Lovecraftian horror, one which naturally produces plot progressions reminiscent of Lovecraft's writings. And the way narrative worked in those games was with onion skins. That is, interlocking layers of information are used to keep the players nested in a certain point in the narrative, and as the player solves the clues left for them in the world or advances some quest lines, those layers unlock. This way, a missing persons case can escalate into the player entering deep cyclopean labyrinths under Brooklyn, where an apocalyptic cult has their rituals. What does this have to do with the changes made to the world of Bloodborne? A lot. Because Bloodborne originally worked a lot like this. Instead of exclusively unlocking more areas, they would also unlock more of the same areas, and would see the world as it really was. Now, functionally, this is still sort of the case, but since the levels aren't as adaptable to players as they would have been in the pre-caveman setup, the effect of this is minimized. Bloodborne's insight mechanic is internally, in notes, referred to as san, for sanity. But it's not as impressive in terms of delivering Lovecraftian narratives as the sanity mechanic in the Call of Cthulhu role-playing games was. But to be fair, that's not exactly its purpose in the current build of the game. There are some things locked behind the player having enough insight, but it's very inconsequential stuff in the grand scheme of things. I said earlier that the insight mechanic was an adaptation of the humanity mechanic from Dark Souls, and I mean, if you look at the code, it is the humanity mechanic. But it was supposed to be more reminiscent of the world tendency mechanic from Demon Souls, where more insight, more knowledge of the Eldritch truths would unlock more of the game, whilst also rendering the player more vulnerable to cosmic horrors. In older builds, we've found evidence that certain enemies were at some point supposed to spawn into levels if the player had reached a certain insight threshold. But as is, insight is mostly a stat we have to check frenzy resistance against, and a stat which enables us to play online. If you don't care about online, then there's no real downside to using insight to buy things in the hunter's dream. As long as you have one insight, you're good. And out of every change Bloodborne had internally, this one and the Moon Cycle one.
Let me go back for a second.
If you don't care about online, then there's no real downside to using insight to buy things in the hunter's dream. As long as you have one insight, you're good.
Isn't that untrue though? Like, doesn't it require specific amounts of insight to see certain things in the world? Like, doesn't it require you to have like a higher number of insight in order to like see some of the amygdala around that can like take you to places? I don't know, just that again, I've not played Bloodborne in like a little while. I've not beaten it in a little while, but I'm pretty sure that you do need more than one insight to do things. So I think while the mechanic is certainly dumbed down from what its potential could have been, I do think that there is still something interesting about having that insight counter there. And personally, while thinking about while he was talking about it, it would have been kind of cool if they had sort of two counters of how much insight you gain in total, and sort of the deeper your total insight is, even after you spent it. It might be kind of interesting to see how that would change the game as you go. Like just have two numbers up there in the insight counter. Have like the left number, have it be like number/number. Have the first number be how much insight you currently have and how much insight total you've gained, right? And then depending on how much you gained is how much that you can see things in the world, and how much you spend are the ones that actually affect like the mechanical side of like summoning and stuff like that. But that's just me throwing out an idea on a game that's almost 10 years old.
And out of every change Bloodborne had internally, this one and the Moon Cycle one seem like easily the most consequential. Insight is still granted to the player passively as they witness things relating to the Eldritch truth, that is, first encountering bosses, defeating bosses, seeing certain areas, and using Madman's knowledge. But it has practically no serious ramifications, with the exception of being able to access the doll for level ups. Speculation is a bit outside the wheelhouse of these sorts of videos, but humor me for a moment. Imagine a Bloodborne whose narrative is propelled forwards not by random doors being openable, but by your continually running around town to investigate a mystery which gives you more insight and gradually reveals more of the horrors. A gameplay loop which goes explore, discover horror, find that the horror has granted you more insight and that there are now new avenues to explore, leading to more horrors, leading to more insight, repeat.
Now, that is a thing that I think it's interesting he's mentioning it here is he's essentially let's go back and get that full point because I was so focused on that dog just taunting him in that group.
Being openable, but by your continually running around town to investigate a mystery which gives you more insight and gradually reveals more of the horrors. A gameplay loop which goes explore, discover horror, find that the horror has granted you more insight and that there are now new avenues to explore, leading to more horrors, leading to more insight, repeat.
Okay, because what he said there is something that sounds really cool and as a concept is cool, but on a mechanical level, it's basically the same as going from one area to the next and slowly unlocking things as you go. The packaging is the thing that's different, and that's something that I don't know if he's going to mention that in a second, but it is one thing where going through some of these games with kind of the attitude of repackaging something in a more sort of a cosmetically pleasing way that can be good, but mechanically it still functions the same way, right? Because just take the Bloodborne now versus what he says. In terms of what actually happens, right? Like what you're actually able to do, things would be different. So instead of and it might be more engaging and more atmospheric. There's no denying that it would be actually pretty cool if we had inside play a bigger role in terms of how we progress the world. But just in general, it's basically the same as fighting through an area, trying to uncover the mystery of what's going on in Yarnum, and then we go through it, and then we encounter something that gives us insight, and that's horrible, and then we go to another area that's probably slightly more mad, slightly worse, right? And then it's the same sort of path. It's just one's wrapped up in sort of a cosmic sort of horror package, and the other's more sort of a physical location shifting package, right? And that's kind of what I think is the ultimate difference between what he's saying and what we kind of got. And I think that's part of the thing that makes his point interesting, but ultimately kind of become a little bit of an issue because he's not really suggesting a major shift in terms of how it works. It's kind of just, it would work the same pretty much, but the game would have to be wrapped up in the world of Insight for it to work, right? Like it's sort of the different pathways to the same sort of end goal or end game type of thing.
I don't think Bloodborne's current narrative is by any means weak, but purely in terms of the systems which prop it up, it isn't any more impressive than what FromSoft had delivered this far. Demon's Souls locked progress behind bosses, you grew as you fought enemies. Dark Souls locked progress behind bosses, and you grew as you fought enemies. Bloodborne could have done something different here because progress could have been more dependent on some actual role playing, with players being rewarded for curiosity, but as is, areas are locked behind bosses and you grow as you defeat enemies.
And again, this is the kind of point I'm saying where, the areas locked behind bosses, you grow stronger as you go through them. It's basically the same thing as if you did it with Insight. Like this is the point that I'm making here, is that all the points he's making would help Bloodborne's overall narrative and aesthetic, but they wouldn't actually change much besides the way you gain insight and the way you progress, right? Like that's also one thing too, is what he's talking about, unless he elaborates on it further, it sounds like he wishes Bloodborne was a different type of game than what the Soulsborne games are, right? Like the Soulsborne games are basically combat-heavy action games with a heavy emphasis on bosses, right? Like the highlights of games are often the bosses, right? Which I think should be the highlights of certain games. But, that is a thing where it sounds like he doesn't understand that what he's saying is functionally the same, but with a different sort of packaging for everything, right? Like, because how would you gain insight in the system that he's suggesting? Would it be just by walking to certain areas? Would it be by actually defeating enemies? Like, how would you measure that? Because it's one of those things that at the end of the day, what happens is what happens, right? It doesn't matter how you package it, it's what happens. And what he's saying would happen in his system would basically be the same type of thing, but instead of with bosses blocking your pathway, now it's insight blocking your pathway. And depending on how you manage how you get insight, that could essentially be the same thing as what we have now, but with insight being the gatekeeper of how you progress as opposed to beating an enemy, right? And it's that kind of like a hairy fairy thing where he's making a point but doesn't realize that his point is almost the same point that you could make in reverse, like I just did, right? Like it's the same type of concept, just with different elements to get you on the same path towards the same goal, right? And it's that kind of thing that I draw issue with in a lot of people's content, is when they make that obvious point that seems so obvious, but you're fundamentally making the same type of system, but you're making it in a different aesthetic and has different mechanics to get you from A to B, but you still get from A to B in a similar fashion to the original system anyway, right? And that's the kind of thing that kind of gets me about stuff like this. It's like, yeah, it would have been cool for insight to play a bigger role than just beating bosses and gaining insight, but you're not really suggesting a different system. You're suggesting the same system, but with a difference in how it's tweaked in terms of like how insight would play a role and how boss fights would affect gaining insight to progress.
Role playing, with players being rewarded for curiosity, but as is, areas are locked behind bosses and you grow as you defeat enemies. It all works, it's all polished, but much like how Bloodborne sort of reached the breaking point of this sort of combat, which meant Sekiro needed to strike at it from a different angle, I think Bloodborne pushes this narrative progression to a logical conclusion as well. Not complaining about what we got, I'm just really curious as to what could have been. Okay, so a lot just happened while I was talking. First, the Snatcher killed me and took me to Yahar Ghul. The Snatchers are acting on behalf of Mensis. kidnapping Yarnamites to feed to their ritual. In Yahar Ghul, I talked to Adela, which I was able to do by donning apparel connected with the church. And we also saw my favorite note in the game, the one which goes, "Behold, a pale blood sky." I've also used this area to demonstrate Ludwig's Holy Blade a bit. I noted earlier that the two-handed variant of it is powerful enough to tackle most of the game, and as you can see, I wasn't kidding. Most enemies are stunned by any strike from it, and so, provided I can get one hit in, I can usually take an enemy out without them being able to fight back. This does come at the cost of not being able to parry, so visceral attacks become locked behind breaking an enemy's damage threshold or successfully pulling off a backstab, but since the weapon itself locks enemies up, this isn't that big of a trade-off. Another great feature of Ludwig's Holy Blade is that it offers almost unparalleled range. If you ever come across a group of enemies, this thing can tear through the lot of them with ease. The weapon also etches the saw spear out in weapon type buffs, since it gains a 50% increase to enemies weak to righteous weapons in both of its forms, compared to the saw spear's 20% damage increase to enemies.
Damn it. Stupid ads. I really need
Not
to get
how
ad
you
block
would've
or
done it.
something.
Weak to serrated weapons. There are admittedly fewer enemies vulnerable to righteous damage than there are serrated damage, but this is still very useful. Just because I think the saw spear is better overall, I cannot stress that this is a very powerful weapon, easily one of the game's best. In addition to everything I've said thus far, it has great arcane scaling. Every weapon in the game is locked behind certain stat requirements. This forces players to dedicate their builds somewhat to their weapon of choice, and as a reward for doing that, weapons also have their damage scaled to certain stats, usually the ones it was locked behind. There is no arcane requirement for using Ludwig's Holy Blade, but since it has an A scaling with it when fully upgraded, we get all of the arcane benefits without any of the costs. Admittedly, this doesn't alter things all that much, since this only begins to count when you slot elemental gems into it, but free damage is never something to scoff at either. Additionally, because of its big number damage output and its ability to stun lock most enemies, it might be one of the best weapons in the game for rallying. When rallying, you recover hit points in proportion to the damage you deal out, with some exceptions, and the large range, high damage and stun lock of Ludwig's Holy Blade means that once you get one hit into an enemy or group, the battle is yours until you run out of stamina. Parl is the first boss in the game which uses elemental damage against us, so, as I said earlier, Henrik's outfit to the rescue. This boss seems to come out of nowhere, considering players can just warp from the Yahar Ghul lantern back to the Hunter's Dream, a consideration which might have been made in case this fight was too hard, but I'm happy it's here, regardless. For one, it grants the Spark Hunter's badge early on in case the player is interested in a build which utilizes both the papers, like I am, or the Tonitrus. Another reason I like this boss's placement is because I feel this part of the game is sort of lacking in really meaty boss fights, and Parl, I think, is among the best in the game. Its crouched body makes its head very accessible, and the head always takes more damage than any other body part. The saw spear has great range, so I'm able to do a lot of consecutive damage on Parl's head, which means its super armor goes down faster. Super armor is a function of enemies by which they momentarily get stunned once you've dealt enough damage to them. My setup drains Parl very quickly, but Parl can be a very difficult boss if you don't know what you're doing. It's very nimble and able to dominate the fight arena with ease. Design-wise, Parl is some of my favorite hitboxes in the game. Because it's so massive, it has to crouch while fighting, and its limbs and spine are very well located for challenging the player. It's not as easy to hit this thing as you might want, but patience is key. Parl's unorthodox physiology harkens back to the crouched giant skeletons in Dark Souls' Tomb of the Giants, and its attacks aren't all that dissimilar to those guys either, except they're more refined. Parl was also pretty dynamic because its bolt damage could be turned off. If you spend too long underneath it, Parl will ground itself and charge up an electric blast. This is a fight or flight moment for players with some serious on-the-fly decision-making to be done. If you're confident in your speed and stamina reserves, you might want to hit Parl to break its charge and shut its bolt buff off, but if you screw that up, get prepared to be absorbed in its blast. The later half of the fight has Parl obtaining ranged attacks as a moving wall of electricity is spawned where it strikes, so it even manages to impart on the player serious considerations for their environment. We've now opened up the door to old Yarnum to talk to Jura. He's been de-aggroed, so we're able to obtain the Powder Keg's Hunter badge without killing him. Jura's placement at the top of this tower actually makes it very easy to kill him, since you can just shoot him until the knockback kicks him off the tower. You'd need to reload the area for his drops to appear, but there you go. If fought properly, Jura is actually quite a tough enemy, and he has the, on paper, strongest weapon in the game, the Stake Driver. Fully charged, the Stake Driver is able to deal more damage in a single blow than any other trick weapon. The real challenge in fighting Jura, however, is the blunderbuss he wields. The fight arena is fairly small, so it's easy for him to stun you and hard for you to safely heal. But since this is a pacifist run, we confront Jura with our words, not weapons. Though, I assure you, I would win if we fought. Jura is a powder keg. The powder kegs were a faction of hunters who specialized in things which went boom. Their badge reads, "Badge crafted by the powder kegs, the heretics of the workshop." The powder kegs' adoration of complex design and big booms culminated in weapon designs that contrast with those traditionally of the workshop. The late powder kegs, bless their souls, had a motto: if a weapon ain't got kick, it just ain't worth it. I've made my bias towards big numbers apparent already, so it should come as no surprise that I quite like these guys, and the weapons which are associated with them. There's no way to actually join them as a faction. Bloodborne, sadly, does not have as many joinable factions as it has factions in the world, but the presence of factions still adds some flavor to the game. Take the Executioners. On our way from Yarnum to the Forbidden Woods, we'll stumble upon Alfred, who, if prompted, is all too eager to give us an, admittedly biased, lecture on the vile bloods of Canehurst. There'll be time later to delve deeper into them, but I want to address a complaint which I imagine some of you might have about this video thus far, and that is my liberal talk of cut content. The issue I imagine some of you might have is that talking about cut content is ignoring the continuity presented in the game. That
Hold on, let's back that up a little bit.
video thus far, and that is my liberal talk of cut content. The issue I imagine some of you might have is that talking about cut content is ignoring the continuity presented in the game. That canon only refers to what is actually, again, in the game. And I respect that view up to a certain point. Bloodborne went through many iterations, and it's very clear that the team changed their minds as to what sort of game this was supposed to be as they were making it.
Okay, because I thought he was going to say something else, but my whole part of the reason why I don't cover cut content a lot in my commentaries of games is that I don't think there's really a point to discuss it when talking about the game, because it's like talking about unused scenes in a movie when they weren't filmed, right? It's not like an extended cut exists where the stuff is there. It's like this stuff is not in the game. So, it's interesting to talk about in terms of where they were going with ideas and things like that. But in terms of the game we got, I think it's more important to talk about the game we got and where it came from and sort of what made it through the cracks. Like it's also, it brings up the problem of potential, right? There are a lot of games that have a lot of potential, but fuck it up, right? Like Dark Souls 2 is probably a really good example. That they had a lot of potential to do a lot of really great things, but they just had issues in the production. The team clearly didn't have the same sort of vision that the other team did when they made Dark Souls 1. And it's it's the black sheep of the Souls series for a reason, right? It's not that they had good ideas that were It's not that they had good ideas that were implemented poorly alone. They had a lot of bad ideas that were implemented poorly as well, right? And that's part of the problem of talking about different aspects of these games in terms of what they were trying to make versus what they ultimately made, right? Like we can't, in my view, you can't criticize any kind of creative endeavor based on what they think they're making, right? A lot of people think they're making Lord of the Rings when they write a fantasy thing. What you could end up making is a Twilight, right? Like you can make something that's abject shit and think you're making the next Lord of the Rings, right? And it's just because of that inward bias you have of liking what you're writing, right? But it doesn't mean it's good. That's one thing that can be a problem for a lot of people when it comes to, looking over different aspects of these series as they sort of go along.
Additionally, in data mining, often it is very difficult to know where one build ends and another one begins. And much of what the Bloodborne data mining community has discovered is stuff which was cut because FromSoft decided to go a different direction. I've tried my hardest to separate what was cut for creative reasons from technological and time restraint reasons thus far, and will continue doing so going forwards. But going forwards, I am going to ask that those who don't already accept that the cut content still has significance, not only as novelty things to know about the game, but also genuine significance in narrative canon. The problem with dismissing all of it on the grounds that only what made it into the game is canon is that, one, if you care about the game on its own merit, you should probably care about what the creative vision was. If you ignore narrative significant content simply because it was cut, you will be making it unnecessarily harder for yourself to connect the game's story, and you'll be forced to fill in blanks which have very clear and concise answers. And two,
It sounds like he's kind of making a defense because it sounds like he made a defense to try to counteract what I literally just said, right? It sounds like he's got an issue with people who don't want to talk about stuff that was in the data mining or stuff that didn't show up in the game because it's not part of the game. And it feels a little defensive. Like it feels a little defensive the way he's explaining it all. So let's go back and get that whole point before I respond to it.
So going forwards,
properly.
But going forwards, I am going to ask that those who don't already accept that the cut content still has significance, not only as novelty things to know about the game, but also genuine significance in narrative canon. The problem with dismissing all of it on the grounds that only what made it into the game is canon is that, one, if you care about the game on its own merit, you should probably care about what the creative vision was. If you ignore narrative significant content simply because it was cut, you will be making it unnecessarily harder for yourself to connect the game's story, and you'll be forced to fill in blanks which have very clear and concise answers. And two, what made it to retail wasn't the most important stuff, but rather the easiest to assemble stuff. Now, post DLC, many of the threads which the culling process left bare have been fixed, more or less. But in the interest of a deep dive on this game, cut content is still on the table, if only because it warrants knowing about. I will continue making a distinction from what I believe was cut for creative reasons and what I believe was cut for technological reasons. And if you don't like what this does to the canon, you don't need to accept all of it as fact. I do for much of it, and understand that that might make this video harder to digest, but I don't see why I should ignore Miyazaki's very blatant and obvious answers just because SCE could not extend the team another 2 months of development time to iron out the kinks in certain areas. The Forbidden Woods is the first deviation from the cityscape levels we've gotten so far. On a whole, Bloodborne is way more urban than it may seem far. First deviation from just because SCE could not extend the team another 2 months of development time to iron out the kinks in certain areas. The Forbidden Wood.
So was that his whole point? His whole point was just don't dismiss it because it's not in the game? Was that his whole point? I thought it was leading to something deeper. He just moves on to the Forbidden Forest after that. That's kind of, man. But I mean, like, it kind of goes with what I was saying earlier. It's just like the important, like he said during that sort of little bit, is that, you know, the what made it into the game was more of like what was easiest to make, not the most important stuff. And it's like, that's bad, right? Like, you should put the most important stuff into the game first, right? And maybe it's bad wording, you know, but it is a thing where, like, a lot of these games never get fully developed as far as they want to go, right? It seems to be a recurring theme with From Software that a lot of their games never reach sort of their full potential. Oftentimes they sort of hit like a budget limit or like a time limit or something, and they have to wrap up. And I really wonder what would happen if you took one of their games and gave them an unlimited budget, unlimited time, and then let them do what they wanted, right? Because as far as I know, I think every one of their games ran into those hurdles, like every single one of them, as far as I know. I'm a little mixed on Elden Ring because I know that's been in development for a while, but I'm not sure if that's really the game to kind of point out as this is them with no holds barred sort of a thing. I don't know. But anyway, I guess we'll get into Forbidden Woods. I'm kind of underwhelmed that he didn't make a more significant point with all this setup. You know, basically just saying that, you know, it's basically just saying like there are lots of things that you can bring in to talk about with the game that are in the code that just aren't realized in the game unless you data mine or unless you do research into it. It's like, you know, I mean, I think it's a very strong argument just on for simple reasons that we should talk about what we got. And I think that's the reason why a lot of people like commentaries like Matthew Matosis and ones like me, is because we talk about what we got. You know, it's like we're not theorizing about what could have come next, you know, based on conjecture and what they had in a previous build and all this other stuff. While that stuff can definitely be interesting, again, I'm not trying to discount that stuff, but his defense of it seems to be you should take it all into account when talking about the game as a whole. And it's like, yes, but at the same time, you need to talk about what's in the game. Like, you need to focus on what is in the game, because the important stuff of the game is what actually gets released, right? If they have a billion great ideas, but then release 50 bad ones, and the game is bad because of that, the game is still bad, right? It doesn't matter how good the ideas are behind the scenes. It matters what actually makes it into the finished product, right? And that's the one reason that Dark Souls 2 and the Scholar of the First Sin versions kind of pointed out with From Software is that the ideas in Dark Souls 2 were not underdeveloped, right? They were just bad ideas to begin with, right? Because if Scholar of the First Sin really wanted to make the game they wanted to make, why is it barely different from the original Dark Souls 2? You know, and that's that kind of point, is like the developers can make the game they want to make, but they got to streamline it and they have to do what they can given the time and the budget, right? And things are going to be left on the cutting room floor. That happens with pretty much every creative endeavor ever. It's like you're going to have extra stuff that just doesn't make it out there for X, Y, or Z. Now, I don't think we should discount it because it didn't make it. But if it's a previous version of something that was developed later on, I think it's fair to say that you can sort of mention it, as sort of a lead into where it kind of came now. But I do believe the focus should be on what we ultimately got and how that compares and contrasts to what they wanted to do. But anyway, let's get into the Forbidden Woods. We'll probably end off after this Forbidden Woods section, just because we got about an hour into this run, which is pretty good.
But is the first deviation from the cityscape levels we've gotten so far. On a whole, Bloodborne is way more urban than it may seem. Demon's Souls warped the player to levels which were spread out all across an entire country. Dark Souls managed to cram in an incredibly large array of biomes, which helped the cramped world layout feel incredibly expansive. And Dark Souls 2 tried to mix both approaches and simulate an entire continent. Bloodborne's is the most localized setting of the bunch, and areas like the Forbidden Woods help to break up what might otherwise have been an overload of Gothic architecture. I've always seen the paths out of Yharnam as quiet time relative to the early game and late game. We go from fighting for our lives in the city to being dropped into a nightmarish waking version of it, so it's good that the middle game gives us access to the Forbidden Woods, Bergenworth, Hemwick, Canehurst, and the Nightmare Frontier. That the game slows down somewhat to let us breathe. Interestingly, though, Hemwick, Canehurst, and the Nightmare Frontier are completely optional areas, and two of them are accessed in the Forbidden Woods. To get to the Nightmare Frontier early on, we need to acquire the Tonsil Stone from Patches right here, and to get to Canehurst, we first need to access the inside of Yosefka's clinic to fetch the Canehurst summons. Patches is interesting in this area because he will come to inhabit the first house we visit, almost as a means of ensuring that players talk to him. Structure-wise, the Canehurst summons have the effect of making the Forbidden Woods a bit clunky, since we need to redo a portion of the level when we decide to go for Bergenworth, and we also need to finish Hemwick first for Canehurst. If this were a mandatory portion of the game, I imagine there'd be more complaints about this setup, but since it's optional, it's fine. And if we're
That's one thing I'd say actually is I don't think there's necessarily anything bad about retreading old ground, because I think it can be important for going to optional areas later on. Like with here, like going to Canehurst, you have to get the letter from ISF's clinic to be able to reach Canehurst, and you have to come back through this area, like to go to that little like carriage stop point. I forget what it's called, but it's like it's near the Witches of Hemwick, right? And it's a thing where I think it's actually a good design philosophy to tease the player with an area that leads somewhere else and give them what they need to it later on so that they can come back to it, right? Because one thing that I think severely cripples playing through a lot of games is when every area is sort of a one and done situation. You don't have a reason to come back, right? And I think that's one thing that a lot of these games can suffer from, is like when you go, like Dark Souls 2 suffers from this massively, because you'll go through one area, you'll do everything there, then you'll move on, and you'll have no reason to return other than like maybe one Covenant thing, right? And it's a thing that makes the area very forgettable because of that fact, right? Like you don't come back through it. Like a good example in Dark Souls 2 is the Hades Tower, right? Like Hades Tower is, I just had a huge brain fart trying to think of that name. But Hades Tower, there's not much there, and I'm talking about the base version, by the way. There's not much there besides one NPC you talk to and one Covenant you can interact with. Now, granted, you don't have to have like 5 NPCs per area or anything crazy like that, but the NPC you talk to moves after you talk to her, and the Covenant guy just sits there and waits for Covenant stuff. Once you go back through the area, there's no real reason to return at all once you've beaten the bosses, I mean, unless you want to farm the items that the big guys drop, right? But you can do that with any area. And I think it is a thing where a lot of areas in Dark Souls 2 become very forgettable afterwards because they're a one and done sort of situation where there's no reason to come back. Right? Like with like with the Dark Souls 1, for example, has several areas where you can go through them and come back through them later on. And you can go to them for different reasons. Right? Like you go through like you can go through the Valley of Drakes for a myriad of reasons, right? You can use it to get from Firelink to Andre pretty quickly with a little know-how. You can go to the valley. You can go through the Valley of Drakes to get to the Blight Town, so that's helpful. I mean, you don't really go through it, but you cross through it, right? But you can also use it as a shortcut after you open the New Londo ruins up and deflood the area. You can go through that area multiple times. That serves different purposes as you cross the physical world that exists, right? And you can use it early game, mid game, and late game, and that's one of the best areas of Dark Souls 1 because of that. Level design wise, it's not anything really that special. It's kind of just like you're on the edge of a cliff, and then here's a bunch of areas. But in terms of how its placement affects the rest of the game, I think is very useful, and it's very effective in connecting all these different areas. And one thing that I really liked about Elden Ring was how they kind of took that and expanded upon it, where you have all these different routes to get to all these different places. Like there's a lot of different ways to get from some of the like sort of main hub zones to the other areas, right? Like going from Limgrave to Caelid, there are several different paths you can take to get there. You can take the portal to the dragon. You can just run down the road. You can take some jumping of the spirit springs to jump up. And there are several pathways that lead there that will allow you to go through different areas, to do different things, to reach sort of the same area. Now, Elden Ring is very different in terms of how its map works, but it's still kind of the same basic idea of retreading, old ground can sometimes be good for showing people different pathways to different things.
If we're considering the setup to optional content in other FromSoft games, it's downright brilliant. I don't think I need to remind people of the needlessly long chain of events needed to access Dark Souls 1's DLC.
If you compare gaining access to that DLC to getting access to Canehurst, it's night and day, and Canehurst comes across as so much more bearable in playing because you can actually map accessing Canehurst to the natural progression of the game.
Which you can also do with Dark Souls 1. I do it all the time. Right? It's like, it's one of those things where he's making a criticism of Dark Souls 1. And it's like, yes, the steps to get to the DLC of Dark Souls 1 is more complicated than the stuff like to get to Canehurst, but you can also do it along the road to completing the game like normal, right? It's not like you have to go out of your way to find a whole bunch of shit, right? Like, I'd actually say that Dark Souls 2 is a really good example of kind of having to go out of your way to get shit to get to the DLC in Scholar, right? But then the other DLCs are very much just go to this location, interact with this bonfire, or talk to this person. Boom, you're there. And I think there is something to be said about how deep you want it to go for people to unlock the DLC, right? Like I think Dark Souls 1 strikes an interesting balance of the two, and I think Bloodborne and Dark Souls 1 are both good examples of how to integrate going to an optional area into the world. I think that's a pretty good way to do things. But I do think that if Dark Souls 1 was oversimplified, where you just killed the golem in the Duke's Archives and got the pendant, and if you went down to the lower area, I think why am I blanking on areas today? I don't know why, but like if all you had to do was just kill the golem, get the pendant, then go down to Darkroot Basin, I mean, I don't think it would really change much in terms of what you actually have to do. But it is also a difference that should be noted is that Dark Souls 1's, requirements to reach the DLC are to reach content that's not in the physical game unless you have the DLC, right? Right, like getting to Canehurst is an optional area in the base game. It's not content that showed up later, right? So that's a distinction that needs to be mentioned, because one is to get you going to make sure that you're at the appropriate point to tackle the DLC, right? Because the thing with the Old Hunters DLC, like if you want to compare DLC to DLC, the Old Hunters DLC is very easy to get to, like once you know what you need to do, right? It's a couple of simple steps and then you're there. Now, Dark Souls 1 stuff is, I think, is pretty well balanced for that game and given the time, especially considering that you have to essentially be at the point where you can fight the you effectively reach the halfway point of the game. You have to clear Anne Orlando, or clear it. You need to beat Ornstein and Smo, and then put the Lord Vessel on the altar, and then you can access, and then you can access everything for the DLC. But given that, you have to defeat the Hydra, all right, which will give you some souls. You have to fight your way down there, which can give you some souls. You have to fight your way up through a little bit of the Duke's Archives to get that, right? So all those little things are helping you level up that little bit extra. That way, when you do get to the DLC, you're not completely overwhelmed by how difficult some of those bosses are, because they are difficult, right? And that is one problem with some of these games, is when you can get to the DLC content, because the content is built to be more difficult than the base game stuff, but you can access it before you reach the end game of the base game stuff. And that's kind of a problem. That's kind of a problem that kind of pops up in a lot of these games, where the DLC is accessible very early on in the game, and it doesn't really appear until later on, right? Like I think Dark Souls 3 is probably one of the worst cases of this. Well, actually, Dark Souls 2 and 3 both have a serious problem with this. Just with Dark Souls 3, it's like you can end up fighting one of the hardest bosses in the game in Frida, like after reaching like a bonfire before you fight your first Lord of Cinder, right? Like you can be massively under leveled for that area, and it does suck. And I'm looking up the requirements to get to the Old Hunters DLC now, because I don't quite remember when you unlock it. Trying to see. Okay, so I'm just looking on the wiki real quick just to see what the requirements are to reach the DLC. So the thing is, defeat Amelia, activate the skull, go to the Hunter's Dream, receive the Eye of the Blood Drunk Hunter, go to the Cathedral Ward, and then get grabbed by the Lesser Amygdala, and then we'll be taken to the Hunter's Nightmare. And then we're there. Right, so basically defeat one boss, grab an item that pops up in the area you go back to anyway a dozen times, and then get grabbed by something else, right? Everything's very convenient, for the DLC. And again, if you're going to complain about Dark Souls 1, I expect you to complain about the DLC when we get there, which we'll have to see, because that's way down there. It's way down there. So we'll see how far we get. But anyway, back to the video.
The underground area leading back to Yharnam is a good example of how the core gameplay changes the expressive capabilities of the level designers. Level design is always informed by the gameplay, so assessing quality on this front requires considering gameplay first. A good level in one game might be disastrous if imported over to another. And the underground area here is interesting to analyze, considering the studio legacy predating this game. This entire area is drenched in poison-afflicting water, with small islands where players are safe. Wandering through this area are giant Sumerians, which the Healing Church repurposed for the church giant enemies on the surface, which means safety comes at the price of combat. There are items strewn around the area to entice players to wander from the safe path, and caves leading to dead ends. Should the player be reckless enough to wander into one of these caves, the entrance will be sealed by an army of maggots who will hit stun the player and kill them. This is not a new type of FromSoft area, status ailment swamps, or a Miyazaki trademark, but it's remarkably understated in the great scheme of things. Bloodborne does not use status ailments to direct the player's navigation as much as other FromSoft games, even though it had multiple opportunities to do that. The sewer in the beginning of the game could have been one such area, as could the fishing hamlet without a lot of changes. I noted already that traps on a whole lean more on combat than in previous games, but actually, when levels in this game have setups to shake up the gameplay, on a whole they are more about combat than nebulous status ailments. We're advancing the Yosefka questline right now by meeting imposter Yosefka. I think she's a member of the choir come to perform experiments to master the art of ascendancy before the menses ritual is finished commencing. So any NPC players will have sent to this place up until now will unfortunately not be making it. Not that the NPCs they sent to Erdon Chapel will have the best go of it either. I went over this earlier, but there seems to be a bit of a disconnect with the kinds of NPC storylines we get in Bloodborne compared to the means by which the world is laid out. On a blind playthrough, most players will never meet imposter Yosefka, let alone the real one, and this has to do with the player constantly making progress through the world and the
This is actually one thing that I thought about, because I remember at the beginning of the video I kind of agree with him that a lot of people can miss Iosefka's clinic, but at the same time, I think you can actually see that door is closed if you die to the Scourge Beast at the beginning and then respawn at that lantern. Like, I'm pretty sure you could see it, and that might actually push a lot of people to like talk to her. So it might be a thing where maybe her placement isn't the best, but players can still be pushed to see her if they just look around for half a second before engaging the Scourge Beast. You know, it's not like she's down like a hallway where you have to go through a bunch of invisible walls or shit, or some shit, right? Like, she's just up a staircase.
NPCs largely being stationary. Dark Souls' NPCs, comparatively, could show up in levels if you had triggered their quests earlier, and that helped that game's world feel a bit more alive. And Demon Souls' NPCs, they were stationary in the Nexus, but the Nexus was an area you constantly came back to. I'm not exactly sure why FromSoft opted to make most of the NPCs stationary in Bloodborne, considering it really doesn't congeal with the way this game's mechanics tell its story, but I can understand how they might have been constrained by the story that is being told. When madmen and beasts roam the streets, the variety of persons who can realistically survive in the open is diminished. But the same can be said for Dark Souls, and I don't think anyone would really be upset if Bloodborne had more hunters we could talk to, as Dark Souls 1 had adventurers. The lore change to blood echoes, from being literal blood to being the sensation of blood drunkenness, meant roaming NPC vendors were not workable, so it might be that the game having fewer roaming NPCs generally was a byproduct of less of a need for them, but I think the real culprit is the hunter's dream. Dark Souls' world was major league propped up by the independence it offered the player from any real hub. Firelink Shrine is clearly the main one in that game, but the player is not locked to it like they are to the Hunter's Dream here. And in Dark Souls 1, every mechanic from Demon Souls was redesigned to make the player a more independent agent. Estus replaced Moongrass, since it freed the designer from having healing items be farmable in every level. In Demon Souls, you could buy those, but since it's possible to be penniless in that game, the developers made it so that it can be farmed off of enemies. In fact, every Artstone in Demon Souls had a specific resource be farmable of its enemies. But because the player can't just warp back to the castle where the enemies drop healing items in Dark Souls 1, healing items needed to either be updated to not be dependent on farming, or every area needed to include enemies which could be farmed for healing. That's where the Estus system came from. And, controversially, that's where I argue it should have stayed. I have never seen it as the out-and-out upgrade to Moongrass like many people, but I could see the reasoning for keeping it if Dark Souls 2 and 3 and Sekiro were to also lock warping from the player, which they don't. And this is why Bloodborne veering away from Estus is very interesting to me.
All right, let's go back there because that's kind of the one of the meat and potatoes of one reason I argue the Estus system is better.
Souls 1, healing items needed to either be updated to not be dependent on farming, or every area needed to include enemies which could be farmed for healing. That's where the Estus system came from. And, controversially, that's where I argue it should have stayed. I have never seen it as the out-and-out upgrade to Moongrass like many people, but I could see the reasoning for keeping it if Dark Souls 2 and 3 and Sekiro were to also lock warping from the player, which they don't. And this is why Bloodborne veering away from Estus is very interesting to me.
Hold on a minute. I gotta get this thing because he's making a point and then he just randomly brings up warping.
Controversially, that's where I argue it should have stayed. I have never seen it as the out-and-out upgrade to Moongrass like many people, but I could see the reasoning for keeping it if Dark Souls 2 and 3 and Sekiro were to also lock warping from the player, which
What? How do those two things deal? We're talking about you're talking about the healing mechanics. How does warping affect the healing mechanic whatsoever? Right? Like how does that affect it at all? I'm really confused by that because it's like I mean, here's the thing, right? Is no matter which way you slice this, or compare like the different games in terms of healing versus warping, like there are a lot of games that function without warping where you can continue through the game. I mean, like Demon Souls made it where you didn't really have to warp back to the Nexus to get healing items unless you were just really poor at the game and were completely out. Like enemies dropped them fairly often, right? And it's similar in Bloodborne where the blood vials are dropped fairly often as you're running around Yarnum, right? It's not like it's not like you have to go back to the hub to resupply them. Yes, there is a vendor there, but the enemies drop them fairly often as you're progressing through the world of Bloodborne, right? And part of that is because you don't rest at the lanterns. You use lanterns only for travel. They don't have any other purpose than for travel and being like a point of respawning, right? Like the bonfires in the Souls games had more significance initially and then were drastically bogged down by simplicity afterwards, right? So let's back this up again just to get his full point because I really don't know where he's going with this, and it seems kind of random.
system came from. And, controversially, that's where I argue it should have stayed. I have never seen it as the out-and-out upgrade to Moongrass like many people, but I could see the reasoning for keeping it if Dark Souls 2 and 3 and Sekiro were to also lock warping from the player, which they don't. And this is why Bloodborne veering away from Estus is very interesting to me. It's almost like an acknowledgement that the healing system should be designed around the game rather than the other way around.
What? Let's back that up again. Get the full thing.
Which they don't. And this is why Bloodborne veering away from Estus is very interesting to me. It's almost like an acknowledgement that the healing system should be designed around the game rather than the other way around. Because the player...
Hold on a minute. What do you mean the other way around? The game, like the healing system is a fundamental system in any game that involves health management, right? If the healing system does not work, then the games don't function, right? It's paramount to the game fucking working right. Like what? Like what the hell?
And this is why Bloodborne veering away from Estus is very interesting to me. It's almost like an acknowledgement that the healing system should be designed around the game rather than the other way around.
I mean, this is the thing, right? It's like the option is not one or the other, right? Like you can have like a game where they tweak the healing system as they go and then change it based on how they want the rest of the encounters to go, right? Like Dark Souls is not made the way it is because of the Estus system, right? It's not the other way around. It's a symbiotic relationship where this is the amount of healing they can give the player at this point in the game. Here's the amount of challenge that we can reasonably throw at them before they run out of resources, right? Where they have to get good, as it were, right? Like that's the whole point of why the flask system worked really well in Dark Souls 1, is because you had very limited healing, and so using them was a lot more strategic. In Demon Souls, you could just farm the fuck out of that stuff, and you could just spam it whenever you needed it, because you get it everywhere. You get it everywhere in all different varieties, and you could eat the appropriate grass whenever you lost the appropriate amount of health, right? It made it where it was super easy and not tactical unless you were in combat needing to heal, right? Like, take any of the poison swamp areas in any of these games. If you have farmable health points, right, through these items, you completely take away the challenge of poison. You completely mitigate it because you have so much healing that you can outlast it, right? And this is one thing that I brought up in my Dark Souls commentary, is that in my Dark Souls 2 commentary, sorry. The problem with Dark Souls 2 healing is that they give you so many options, right, to heal, that the game becomes a bit of a joke after each fight. Because part of the sense of getting good at Dark Souls was that your Estus count was your mistake allowance, right? And as you got better at the game, you realize that you would get to a boss maybe the first time with 0 Estus, and you'd be like, oh fuck, how am I going to win? Maybe the next time you get there with 1, maybe the next time you get there with 2, right? You're getting better at the game, and you can see that in the healing resources that you have because you're using them less often. They're still there. You still have the same number of them, but you're getting better at the game as a result. In the other games, you don't have to get better, because even if you barely survive combat, you can just sit and get health back because you've got a billion different ways to heal, whether it be Bloodborne, or not Bloodborne, whether it be Demon Souls or Dark Souls 2, right? You get a fuck ton of grass and life gens in those games, right? You will survive unless you're just really, really terrible at the game, right? Like attrition is not an issue in those two games because you have so many ways to heal, right? And that's part of the problem with their difficulty, is because when you can just outlast any damn enemy once you get it right, it doesn't become a thing of skill as much as it does just timing, right? It's not about strategy as much as it is just outliving the thing that's trying to kill you, right? And that's one of the big problems with the grass system. Now Bloodborne, I think, does do an interesting take on it where it limits it in terms of how much you can actually hold, right? With the base being, 20 for each, and then you can upgrade it in small increments, with the different runes and whatever. And I think Bloodborne is a good natural step forward from the previous systems of Demon Souls and Dark Souls 2, where you can get healing items in the world as you progress, but you also don't have to really worry about having an excessive amount of them as you go along, right? It struck a nice middle ground, I would argue, and that's part of the reason why I think it's a pretty good system. Now, is it perfect? No, and I detailed my criticisms of it and how I think they could mitigate some of the farminess of it that you get in the other games, right? Because the one thing about both Demon Souls and this game is that if you get stuck on a boss or stuck on an area, you're going to waste a lot of resources going through it. And that's a problem, because then you have to go and grind a bunch of points to buy more of them. And it's also kind of stupid that they get more expensive. It's like, I don't get why Bloodborne makes these things more expensive when you can run out of them and then be fucked, right? Like, imagine if you ran out of Estus, if you use too much Estus in a given level, right? Like, that's stupid, right? Same thing with grass and Demon Souls. Dark Souls 2 is the weirdest one because you have the refreshable healing source in the Estus, but you also have the restorable with the life gems, right? And so it's a really weird mix of both of them, but it also gets the pros and cons of both systems. And it's one of those things where I feel like he's not aware of how the difficulty is affected by having very, very limited healing sources. I mean, this is one thing. If you want to take anything from anyone, if you want to take anything from any of these games, Bloodborne's living proof that the developers understand that they need to limit healing, while still making it plentiful to get. Right? Like Bloodborne's probably the best example of this, because you can kill enemies that will drop health sometimes, right? And you can only have so many in your inventory at once, and the game is crafted to work within the means of 20, blood vials as you go from sort of area to area, right? Like it's probably the biggest middle ground that we've gotten between excessively farming a shit ton of health points versus having very, very limited health points. Or like I keep saying health points, health restoration items, right? It's just like this is it's like it's just like this is a thing where the game you're talking about doesn't defend your point.
Them should be designed around the game rather than the other way around. And because the player can buy vials in the Hunter's Dream, and because healing is now attached to the combat, going back to depletable resources for healing makes a lot of sense to me.
I literally would argue the opposite.
I understand if you don't like it, but if we had Estes here, then players would not be forced to desperately lean on rallying for health like they are now.
No, that's not how the rally mechanic works. Rally is a good way to get health back while attacking. It has nothing to do with your other health resources unless you have no health resources left or they're dwindling, right? Like that's like he keeps drawing weird points from the things that people would argue, right? Like the whole point of the rally system is to be able to get health back before you get hit again, right? By attacking, right? That's a system that helps the player be more aggressive while also restoring health. So it's beneficial to the player if timed right. But if not timed right, they will take more damage, potentially die, or they'll have to back off and heal with an item that they may not have a replenishment of later on, before they kind of reach the next sort of like difficulty jump with a boss or the next time they reach a lamp. Like, holy shit.
I understand if you don't like it, but if we had Estes here, then players would not be forced to desperately lean on rallying for health like they are now. And the ramifications of that mechanic might have been somewhat diminished. The point.
Well, this is one thing, right? What do you mean that it would be diminished based on what? Like, how much Estus are you giving yourself? Right? Because this is one thing that I've always believed when talking about the healing in these games is the healing needs to be balanced per the area you're in. Like, it doesn't matter. Like if you took the Estus system from Dark Souls 1 and put it into Bloodborne, they would have to account for how much Estus you can have at a given point in the game, right? Like, they're not going to give you 20 Estus off the bat in Bloodborne if it was the same sort of strength level at healing as it was in Dark Souls 1, right? They would balance it in some way. Maybe they give you 10, right, and have the enemies drop it, or maybe they give you 20 and enemies don't drop it, right? Like they would adjust the system accordingly, right? Changing the Estus system for the system in Bloodborne, they're not comparable, right? Unless you adjust them based on the game they're in and the functionality of those systems within the game, given the context of all the other mechanics in the game, right? It's a symbiotic relationship that you have to not deal with, but that you have to account for when comparing these two systems, right? The reason that you can easily compare grass and life gems is that they both drop from enemies, they're both easily farmable, and they're both reasonably cheap to get, right? And you can stack a fuck ton of them in your inventory. Now, they are different. Grass is more instant. Life gems are a little bit slower, or much slower, but they still serve the same sort of purpose of healing you constantly throughout the game as you pick up more of them and as you stack them, right? It's not like having 100 Estus in your inventory, right? That you can use instantly and things like that. Like, again, this is the thing is blood vials are very different because they're very mechanically restrictive, and that's one reason why I would argue that the blood vials are actually not as good as Estus, is because they're very restrictive. And you can notice that whenever you look at them, they only heal, I think, for a third of your health, and I think you can boost it to maybe like 40% of your health. But they're kind of locked to a percentage. They're not a specific amount like the Estus is, right? And that means that certain Estus usage in other games can be more meaningful because they are hard numbers. They give X amount. They don't do percentages. They give X amount of health back, right? So that can be very useful in certain situations, but it can also, lead to you having to make a decision whether I should, use this now and risk, wasting all this other health that I could have gotten if I waited to use it later. It's like it seems like he's giving a bad comparison on purpose, because there's so many basic logical points, that like don't work, if you compare the systems appropriately. Sound like H Bomber's take on DS2. It kind of does in a way. It's just it's one of those things where I feel like people want to justify systems they like instead of saying the parts of it that they do like. Right? Like, I think a plus of Bloodborne's healing system is like like I think a plus of the Bloodborne's healing system is that it did take a little bit from the Estes system, but also took a little bit of the Grass system from Dark Souls and Demon Souls, right? Like, it's kind of nice that you have a hard top, like you have a hard top limit of like 20, unless you upgrade it to like 27 or whatever the max is. But it's also nice that you can get them throughout the level, which keeps you playing the game, right? It's that weird sort of middle ground between like this, when you compare this game and Dark Souls 1 in terms of how its healing affects the combat of the game. It's like Bloodborne, you can heal a lot more, but the enemies drop more of it in the world. So it's like it's a little bit easier to deal with than Dark Souls 1. And I would argue that's kind of a bad thing in favor of Bloodborne. But anyway, let's keep going and see what his point is. I want to see if this point leads to something else or if he's just going to keep going.
Players would not be forced to desperately lean on rallying for health like they are now, and the ramifications of that mechanic might have been somewhat diminished. The point of the combat in this game, according to Miyazaki, was to give the player the feeling of fighting for their lives, and the rally mechanic is how that feeling is produced. And if producing that feeling is the goal, then anything which detracts from it might be rightly cut. And going back to NPCs, because we have no incentive outside of runes, badges, and early game items to engage with any of the NPCs, we just aren't going to engage with them as much, and it's going to seem like Bloodborne is lacking in this department, even though it has about 25 NPCs, not counting the Bloodmans, even though much game have no incentive outside of runes, badges, and early game items to engage.
You sound just like the guy who made the Dark Souls 2 commentary for 7 hours. I literally did make that. That was my video. I renamed the channel since then, but yeah, that's pretty much, that was me. I need to go back and see what this transition is that he just did, because it's 1 minute we're talking about healing, the next we're talking about NPC numbers for some reason. I don't get that.
We have no incentive outside of runes, badges, and early game items to engage with any of the NPCs. We just aren't the goal, then anything which detracts from it might be rightly cut. And going back to NPCs, because we have no incentive.
Oh wow, he just made a point, was just like, fuck it, let's go back to NPCs now. It's kind of weird. But I mean, let's just go back one more time.
This game, according to Miyazaki, makes a lot of sense to me. I understand if you don't like it, but if we had Estes here, then players would not be forced to desperately lean on rallying for health like they are now.
When's the Elden Ring commentary for 50 hours coming? I honestly don't know if I'm going to do Elden Ring. I've thought about it a lot, and I know probably a lot of people would like it or like me to talk about it, but just a little bit of a side rant with the Elden Ring thing before we kind of wrap this stream up with this kind of last point Acer's making. But yeah, an Elden Ring commentary would be interesting. It's just the way I do it, I don't tend to do it unless the game is finished. Like my retrospectives are on games that are finished, right? Like they're not in development still, And with Elden Ring's DLC coming out and stuff like that, I don't have enough of a grasp of the DLC to make a good commentary of it. And like when I cover like all the other commentaries I've done for Dark Souls 2 and 3, Dying Light, the Zombie Army series up to this point, and the original like Modern Warfare trilogy, right? Like all those games were done and finished like years ago, right? So like it's not like I'm tackling a game that's still in development. Elden Ring is still in development, so I can't really make a commentary in my style like it, you know. Yeah, it's like I'm trying to wait until everything's all said and done before I talk about the game, you know. Because one thing that I really didn't like about some other critical analysis people I've seen is that they'll talk about a game like within its sort of infancy, and they don't talk about it. You know, it's the reason I don't like the short. One of the reason why I don't like the short, quick sort of reviews of things is that some games need a little bit of time to iron out some problems. You know, and when developers just or when not developers, but like when reviewers review the game and give it like a 9 out of 10, and then the developers like give a update that radically screws up everything, and then they leave it that way. It's like the game is not that ranking anymore. You know, it also serves better over the course of time. You know, if I tackle a game that's fully finished, you know, because when it's fully finished, the developers aren't going to go back and change shit. Hopefully, but you know what I mean. Like it like the videos age better when the game is not changing from the point of the video coming out to the point of whoever watching it actually playing the game. You know. But anyway, I've got to go, but I want to get this last point about the healing thing just because I think it's important to mention.
Back to depletable resources for healing makes a lot of sense to me. I understand if you don't like it, but if we had Estes here, then players would not be forced to desperately lean on rallying for health like they are now.
That all depends on how they balance the Estes. Because this is the thing, right? Estes is balanced different than the blood vials are. That's why the Estes system works in Dark Souls 1 and why the blood vial system works in Bloodborne. I almost said Bloodborne 2. Bloodborne. It's like they're built different, they function differently. Like blood vials heal proportionally. Estises give hard numbers that you can upgrade. Right? There's a difference in how they work, and so they'd have to tweak them based on the game they're changing them over from. Anyway. Yeah. That makes sense. And damn, I came at the tail end of the stream. Yeah. I try to do these streams every Saturday starting around like 11 or 10:30. Sort of like Eastern Standard Time, I think it is. And then I go for like an hour or so. But yeah. And I'm going to be continuing covering this video just because we've got another 5.5 hours to go, and this is stream number I think 4 on it. Yeah. What did I title this? Oh, I forgot to put the part number in this. But yeah, we're getting there. Yeah. See, the whole point is that the healing is based on the aggressiveness of combat. Dark Souls was slower combat. I love all the Soulsborne games, and the healing system works for each type. Yeah, it's like you need to take the system and balance it, given the way it works in the new format. You know, and I think what he's drawing from this is that he thinks people just want the Estus system just thrown into Bloodborne without any balancing, and it feels a little bit like a straw man argument. Like he's just making up how people want it to be balanced, just to say that it wouldn't work with Bloodborne when you could make it work. You know, I mean, like kind of like what I was saying earlier. You know, it's just you can take whatever system you have and balance it for the game, but there's a point to be made that you have to balance it appropriately. You know, like part of the problem with Dark Souls 2 and Demon Souls healing systems are that they're not balanced at all. You can have a metric fuck ton of all the healing items all the time, you know, once you know where the vendors are and once you start farming, right? Like Bloodborne actually does pretty well in limiting that by, you know, making it where you have a cap. You know, you can only have 20 vials at a time, you know, and I think it goes up 27 with like runes and stuff. But like you can upgrade it, but it doesn't make it ridiculous. You know, like going through Dark Souls 2, or actually no, Demon Souls might be a better example. I did I forget what the number was in my Dark Souls 2 commentary video in the analysis section, going over the healing between Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 3. But it's like I calculated it once where if you eat every type of grass and you have a full stack of each type of grass, you're in the realm of like 200,000 hit points or something that you can regenerate on one player before you die. You know, just with the grass, or something like that. It was in the hundreds of thousands in terms of like health you could gain, right? And that's part of the problem, is that you'd gain way too much health back. Yeah, like you said, unbeatable sheep. You know, I hate farming the vials too, and that's part of the problem. That's where the Estus comes in play, because Estus is constantly rechargeable, and that's what makes it a good system. Is it's constantly rechargeable, and you don't have to farm, and you don't have to waste time farming, right? You know, like imagine if you had to farm for flasks in Elden Ring, right? Whenever you get stuck on a boss, you know, it's like that would fucking suck. That would suck to have to farm that shit. You know, it's like, and this is one thing where I think Bloodborne does a pretty good job of balancing its healing items, but I don't think that it is a superior system to the Estus system in the games that they're in, right? Like I think that the Estus system is probably the best system. Like Estus in Dark Souls is better than Blood Vials and Bloodborne, in my opinion, because you don't have to farm them, which is the biggest thing, and you also, you know, have very limited, so you have to get good, like real good at the game. You know, like in Bloodborne, you can fuck around with, you know, an enemy for a little bit and they'll drop vials, right? So they essentially forgive you for fucking up. Whereas in Dark Souls, you're very rarely going to get Estus back unless something specific happens. I forgot what the Estus system is in place, but I know you can get Estus back based on some online thing that happens, and based on like killing invaders and stuff. It really is just kind of a, like, they're balanced in like Dark Souls 1 and Bloodborne. The healing is balanced in their games, but those systems would not work if you just copied and pasted them into the other game. You know, like you have to rebalance them accordingly. Yeah. Yeah, it's like you said, Sheep. The healing is balanced. Just the enemies are fast enough to catch you out. You know, just they're fundamentally different systems, and you have to tweak those systems if you're going to swap them into different games. But yeah. So that's all I've got for this stream. Sadly, I'm sorry you guys jumped in at the 11th hour, but I will be doing these every Saturday when I can. Some of them might be pre-recorded though, so feel free to chat. I will look at the chat later on in pre-recording ones, but I've got to go for real life stuff. But yeah, I'd just like to thank you all for watching this stream. I have no idea how many parts it's going to take to get through this fucking game, or get through this video, I mean. So yeah, hopefully y'all will come around next time. Hopefully next Saturday should be fun. But anyway, I'd just like to thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys later.